We have three speakers today. I will be speaking first, talking a little bit about where we are after the SDG Summit and the opportunities in 2020. We're then going to hear from Ben Phillips, who's going to talk about the grand challenge on inequality and exclusion and what was done on that at the summit and the way forward from there. And then we have Jeff Huffines from Civicus, who is going to talk about the UN in 2020, the 75th anniversary and the state of multilateralism. We've tried to keep a relatively small number of speakers for this call. We had feedback from the previous calls that there was a wish for more opportunities for participation and contributions from the growing number of people joining from across the world. So we're going to then leave plenty of time for your contributions. So just do start to think about how you can chip in. The SDG Summit. Here are some reflections on that and where I think it leaves us as we go forward. We had a summit which was in an incredibly busy week for the UN. I think many of you who are here in New York know, or all of you who are here in New York know that, and many of you will have heard about the climate summit, about the high-level event on financing for development, about a number of other high-level events with the SDG Summit there in the middle. And I think the summit is widely regarded as having begun the process of shifting the SDGs onto a more action-oriented agenda. The heart of the summit was this focus on accelerating actions, actions, and there was a registry for these actions with governments and other actors invited to contribute their commitments to this UN registry, and we saw more commitments on SDG 16 than on any other SDG apart from SDG 17, which covers financing, partnerships, implementation, etc., and is therefore generally relevant to all of the commitments. And I think that's a reflection of the work that the SDG 16+ community did over roughly 18-month period that we were preparing for the high-level political forum and for the SDG Summit. We also had, and you'll hear more about this from Ben, we had heads of state meeting to promise action on inequality and exclusion. We had the launch of Peace in Our Cities campaign. We had quite a lot of mobilization around violence against children, another big push on justice for all. So we had a number of big pushes to try and make the accelerating action on SDG 16+ central to the summit. But then I think within that context, it was clear that compared to the climate summit, the SDG summit was a relatively low profile. And the challenge that the SG gave countries at the Climate Action Summit, where he said, you're not here to talk, you're only here to put actions on the table. The big focus there on transformational change and the big mobilization around that, the Greta effect, demonstrated that there's a long way to go with the SDGs if they're to gain a similar profile to the climate priorities. But I think we have an opportunity to do that. In the political declaration, member states asked for a decade of action and delivery on the SDGs. The UN has also committed as part of its 75th anniversary to really focus on closing the gap, on how we close the gap between our aspirations in the SDGs, in the climate agenda, in other international agendas and current trajectories, which are often negative and certainly not putting us on the path to sustainable development that was promised in 2015. And the Secretary General, in picking up this demand for a decade of action, promised to convene an annual SDG action platform, with the first one part of the UN's 75th anniversary summit on the 21st of September next year. So we think that we have an opportunity to use the action platform as a similar opportunity for mobilization as the climate action platform, to effectively see the SDG Summit as beginning a year-long process that will put a number of more ambitious actions on the table, and to use the 75th anniversary process as an opportunity to get communities working on all SDGs, but in our case, the SDGs for peace, justice, and inclusion, to really focus on on what strategies, what actions, what finances are needed to close the gap between aspirations and realities. So we published at CIC at Pathfinders a challenge paper just yesterday, setting out some of our thinking on how we seize this opportunity, proposing a medium-term objective of looking towards the second SDG Summit and promising to bring measurable change on the SDG 16 plus targets to the table in 2023. And then in order to achieve that, to have a short-term objective in 2020 to build on the platform provided by the SDG Summit, put acceleration action for SDG 16 plus at the heart of the decade of action for the SDGs. At Pathfinders, we're pursuing now three broad policy objectives, a vision and strategy and campaign for halving global violence. So really trying to bring together all of the SDG targets for preventing violence in all its forms. Developing a 4-year strategy and alliance for delivering justice for all, building on the work of the Task Force on Justice that was chaired by ministers from Argentina, Netherlands and Sierra Leone and by the elders. And building on the platform offered by the group of heads of state who committed to pushing for politically viable solutions to rising inequality and exclusion. So these are three big challenges that we'll be working through towards in 2020. And then around that, really beginning to think quite seriously about financing for SDG 16 plus. We don't know the theme for the next high-level political forum that's being negotiated, and that negotiation might take some time. But we do know that the Norwegian President, Rebecca Sock, has made financing for development, financing the SDGs a key priority for her presidency, and we think there's an opportunity to get very serious about the case for investment and financing strategy for the SDGs. We then have some mobilization objectives over the next year, working with the SDG 16 plus community to continue to fill the registry of acceleration actions on SDG 16 and related targets. That registry, we have heard from DESA, will be kept open over the next year, and we hope it will be potentially reskinned, relaunched and given greater profile. Thinking hard and early about the SDG Action Platform as an opportunity to showcase transformational commitments and to bring together high ambition coalitions of countries. And thirdly, trying to take SDG 16 plus out of its silo and put it onto a bigger stage. So we're working. We're looking forward to the Peace One concert, which will be held on Peace Day, which is the 21st of September next year in New York, which we see as a big mobilization opportunity for the SDG targets for peace. Global Citizen have launched their Possible Dream campaign, which they expect to be one of the biggest mobilizations around the SDGs, with concerts not just in New York but on each continent, and many other campaigning moments. So my question for us as a group working on these targets is, first, how do we make sure that at that summit we have, at the SDG Action Platform by next September at the 75th anniversary summit, how do we have a high ambition coalition of countries, or a series of high ambition coalition of countries that are prepared to push transformational action on key SDG 16 plus priorities? How do we make sure that we get the maximum number of credible but ambitious acceleration actions into the registry and package them together into something that is clearly an acceleration in ambition from what we have now? Thirdly, how can we work together on this bigger mobilization, taking the campaigning opportunities, really beginning to bring the voice of children, of young people to the center of pushing for peace, justice and inclusion? And finally, how do we build links between what we're doing and other SDG priorities? How do we build the links between justice and climate, for example? How do we build the links between inclusion and inequality and the SDG targets for poverty reduction, for provision of services? How do we build the links between peace and education? So how do we get the SDG 16 plus message that it is really a critical enabler of success across the SDGs? So I think there's a lot to fight for in 2020, a big opportunity to work with the SG and his team, to work with the 75th anniversary team, and to work with the campaigners around that. And I look forward in the discussion to beginning to build a dialogue on how we can seize that opportunity. So that's more than enough from me. I'm going to hand over now to Ben Phillips, who's going to talk, I think, about some similar issues, but from the point of view of inequality and exclusion, look at some of the ways forward from this. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you, David. Can people hear me? I hope so. And apologies if you've got some background noise. You've got the sounds of Rome in the background, but a very nice place to live, but a little bit noisy. So I'm going to share a bit about the grand challenge on inequality, which, as David shared, is one of the networks, multi-sectoral networks that has been brought together under this platform. What excites me about the Grand Challenge on Inequality Network is that I've spent a lot of my life, almost the past decade, from civil society, from the outside, pushing, challenging with many of you, governments to be the first mover in actually doing something about inequality. We've seen governments shift from denying it was a problem to recognizing it is a problem, from not promising to do anything to now promising, all of them have in the SDGs, to do something about it. We haven't really seen a comparable shift in action. And we really need some governments to move in order to break the inertia and to break the myths that it's not possible to do so. We've really been lacking those vanguard or pathfinder or pioneer governments. We now have some. In the chat, I've shared some pieces that we've written about the initiative to give people a bit more information and background on it. If you click on any of those and have a read of any of those, you can learn a bit more. But essentially, it brings together some pioneer governments determined to do something about inequality. So people like Mexico or Indonesia or Sierra Leone or Sweden, very diverse, from north, south, east, west, every income level, rich and poor. But what unites those countries is that they're really serious about tackling inequality. So that's what's exciting, to have those countries. And we then bring together also multilateral institutions and progressives within those. And we also are connecting in with some great civil society organizations, networks like Civicus, for example, and NGOs like Oxfam, who've done so much on inequality, along with many others, and especially local grassroots organizations. So what we really want to do with this pioneer group of governments, supported by multilateral progressives and supported by NGOs, is four things. The first is develop a menu of some policies that will really tackle inequality. We know that not just one policy will ever do it, so we need a series. We want to help those governments that say that they're serious and look serious to pursue some of these policies. Secondly, we want to help these, where governments are trying to be progressive, we want to help them on the framing, on the coalition building, and on the modifications to make sure that these policies succeed politically as well as succeeding technically. We know that being right is not enough. You also need to be successful. So we want to help that happen. We're going to commission some opinion polling that will help look at how could you maximize support for inequality reducing policies. The third thing we want to do is support those governments and working together with civil society to address some issues internationally. We know that not everything can be dealt with at the country level. Issues like tax justice, for example, need to be dealt with internationally. So we want to help them pursue that. And the fourth thing we want to do is capture the stories of change, because our theory is that you might only initially get 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 governments or so to really take it seriously. But it's through telling that story that you break apart the lie that change is impossible and that you demonstrate it's a political choice. So if we can enable half a dozen or a dozen governments to succeed in tackling inequality, then we will shame the other 180 who will no longer be able to hold on to the myth that nothing can be done. So that's the idea behind the initiative. It's very early days. It's really only just begun. But we're very excited about the different areas of work. We know that civil society pressure remains absolutely essential. So we absolutely need feet held to the fire, governments pushed, even these good governments that are trying to do something, we need them pushed too, because we know that you don't get progressive change without a push. But we also know that the civil society push for action can be undermined if it looks like they're pushing for something good but impossible. And we want to demonstrate that what civil society is pushing for is 100% possible by enabling that half a dozen or a dozen progressive governments to actually do something about it. So that's the plan, and really looking forward to working with all of you on making that happen.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ben. And I think that's a great illustration of what we mean by trying to build a high ambition coalition of both member states and other partners. I think Ben in a recently referred to it as an axis for action, and I think that's that captures what we're trying to do. We're now going to go across to we're about to go across to Jeff, who's going to give us some of the bigger picture. But first of all, do keep putting your hands up if you want to ask questions. After Jeff, we'll be moving on, not just ask questions, make contributions. But after Jeff, we're going to be moving on to the open part of the agenda. So put something in chat, put your hand up, or if you can't do either, then just email Paula, and we'll know that you're waiting to speak. But now I'm going to hand over to Jeff from Civicus, and I think Jeff was the first person I heard talking about what the opportunity of the 75th anniversary for the UN, and now he's going to give us a little bit more of a sense of how that's going to pan out over the next year, and how we, working on SDG 16+, working on peace, justice, and inclusion, can use the 75th anniversary opportunity and contribute to its success. So Jeff, over to you.
Thank you very much, David, for the opportunity to participate in this conference call. I really have enjoyed hearing the updates so far. So for those of you who do not know, I'm Jeffery Huffines. I'm Senior Advisor for UN 2020 on behalf of Civicus. And UN 2020, it's a civil society-led initiative that seeks to provide a platform to promote cooperation and dialogue among civil society groups, governments, and the UN in support of a people-centered multilateralism. Just for your information, UN 2020 is supported by a coordination group that includes Civicus, the Stimson Center, the Workable World Trust, the World Federalist Movement, Frederick Ebert Stiftung, Soraptis International, and others. And since 2017, we have been urging member states, civil society, and UN officials to prepare for a successful, well-prepared 75th anniversary commemoration for the UN next year. That will include a meaningful process of stock-taking, review, and strengthening of the multilateral system. So given these efforts for the last couple of years, we were very pleased that last June, the General Assembly adopted a modalities resolution that decided that the UN shall prepare a leaders summit on the 21st of September to commemorate the 75th under the theme, "The Future We Want, the United Nations We Need, Reaffirming Our Collective Commitment to Multilateralism." The UN will also be organizing other official commemorations on the 26th of June and to commemorate the signing of the UN Charter, and on 24th October in 2020. And they're inviting, of course, countries and peoples from around the world to do the same. And then this last month, on October 24th, the Secretary General also announced the launch of a series of global dialogues on the major challenges we face and the role of international global cooperation to address them, and the role of the UN in particular. So, from the point of view of UN 2020, where it's not a coincidence that we are facing a twin crisis of democracy and multilateralism. And I think all of us were deeply concerned that the UN system is under-resourced, under attack, and unable to respond adequately to the many challenges facing humanity. So there is an urgent need to really address the important MOI of governance with regard to the UN system. So it will be able to meet the challenges of meeting the SDGs and the Paris Agreement by 2030. So next week, on the 12th of November, UN 2020 will be having its next annual strategy meeting. And we're going to be bringing together leaders of key global and regional civil society networks to discuss their participation in UN 75 commemorative events, dialogues, and activities during 2020, and also their participation in the planning of a proposed UN 75 NGO forum in New York this spring. And we also want to discuss our advocacy strategy going forward to influence the outcomes of the UN 75 Leaders Summit in September. The PGA will soon be appointing 2 co-facilitators who will begin the negotiations of the political declaration that would be a major outcome of that summit. And we would like to see coordination between those negotiations and the negotiations of the HLPF review, which will also begin during this session of the General Assembly. So we're very pleased, of course, David, that you'll be joining us at the strategy meeting next Tuesday. And some of the meeting objectives include developing a plan of action, establishing a division of labor based upon proposed thematic working groups on fundraising, on events planning, on UN 75 dialogues, on advocacy, on media and communications. We really see the 75th anniversary as an opportunity to amplify and carry forward key international civil society campaigns to accelerate the achievement of these important global agreements, as we've been discussing with the SDGs, with SDG 16+. But there's also the NPT 2020 review, there's the Paris Agreement, there's Beijing Plus 25, and other campaigns ongoing. So we wanted to strategize on how global civil society can best organize itself to curate progressive and far-reaching reform proposals for further strengthening the UN system. And we would certainly agree with the proposition that while we wish to be ambitious, we also need to be realistic in terms of what's achievable in the short term, medium term, and long term. We're going to be looking to identify important calendar events that civil society campaigns can use to promote UN 75, particularly with the niche of global governance renewal and strengthening in 2020 and beyond. And we do want to begin preparations on a proposed NGO forum, as I mentioned previously, or perhaps a series of forums, a series of dialogues that could be organized in cooperation with the PGA or with the Department of Global Communications to create a critical mass for maximizing global civil society influence on member states in the preparation of the UN 75 political declaration. So I think that covers it for the moment. Thank you.
So Jeff, just a quick follow-up question from me. We have the global dialogue with these 3 questions of, as the UN put it, 3 big questions of what kind of future do we want to create? And I guess in some ways we've got that mapped out through the 2030 agenda, but then critically, are we on track? And I think for our targets, we know that mostly we're not on track. And then the third question, what action is needed to bridge the gap? Can you give participants a bit more of a sense of how they can participate in that conversation, and how we can bring practical suggestions for bridging the gap to the UN and make them a critical part of this global dialogue?
Well, it's a good question. In fact, I would say that's one of the key discussions that we want to have next week on the 12th. And, just to say, I mean, for example, how can we link the energy and ambition that was generated by civil society at UNGA 2019 as a pivot to prepare for UNGA 2020 and UN 75? And so, in terms of the UN 2020 initiative, we see ourselves as more of a clearinghouse and as a coordination point. We're not pretending that we have the resources to be a centralized point of coordinated action across all the dimensions of UN 75. But we are hoping that we'll be able to organize ourselves in such a way that we will be able to kind of point different campaigns and organizations and international networks in the right direction, depending upon their own key objectives of their respective global campaigns. And I mean, just to say too, we're going to be having Natalie Samarasinghe of UN 75, who will be giving a presentation on the UN 75 global dialogues. So in that respect, what we're hoping is that we'll be able to be partners with the Secretariat in curating specific proposals that will come forward through these global dialogues, because as we understand it, one of the goals of the UN 75 campaign organized by the Secretariat and Fabrizio Hauschild is to develop a feedback loop, as they call it, to bring the messaging back from these different dialogues back to the United Nations. But we would also like to have access to those, the results of those conversations, so that can further inform our own advocacy going forward with regard to not only the political declaration that will be adopted. We really anticipate that this political declaration to be adopted by member states on September 21st, we hope will be more of a launching pad to continue strengthening ongoing UN reform measures, but also to perhaps identify other proposals that could be considered by member states going into the future, post 2020. So we're very much hoping that UN 75 and the summit will not be a one-off event, but will indeed be the beginning of a new set of conversations and negotiations going forward into 2030.
Okay, brilliant. So we have this focus on action, this focus on ambition, this focus on really a bigger mobilization, and then this critical question of how the 75th anniversary can begin to build the global structures, the global platforms, the multilateralism that is able to support the change that we're working towards. We're now going to open it up to the floor. I have some people waiting to speak, but please do join that queue if you are keen to chip in. And I also have some questions that were submitted by email, which I'll come to. But I think the obvious first person to go to is Nick Astier from WAFUNA and from the 16+ Forum, because next week we have many of us going to Dili and Timor-Leste for the 16+ Forum, for this big opportunity to showcase past successes and to build a platform for action in the future. I think this is the key global gathering for the 16+ community, and I actually won't be able to be there myself, but we're sending members of the team and very much looking forward to the forum. So Nick, over to you. Tell us what's happening.
Hi, David. Hi, everyone. Hopefully everyone can hear me well, and thank you very much, David, for giving me this opportunity to share a little bit about the annual showcase, which, as you have said, is starting on Monday in Dili, Timor-Leste. So this is the third annual showcase that we are organizing. The first having been held in Tbilisi in 2017. And the second in Freetown last year, about in October of 2018. And so this year's is going to be in Dili, Timor-Leste. As I said, it starts on Monday, November 11th, and it is a 4-day conference aimed at showcasing what SDG 16 looks like in action. Highlighting what implementation looks like and the best ways to go about it, lessons learned moving forward, and the sharing of best practices overall. And so the first day opens up with capacity building workshops. This year we're actually running 2 workshops side by side. One is for civil society organizations that are working or engaging on SDG 16+. And the other one is actually for private sector engagement in SDG 16+. As some of you may know, Timor-Leste has a very nascent up-and-coming private sector, and we thought that this was a great opportunity to kind of highlight the links between the private sector and SDG 16+, and delve further into what it is that the private sector can do moving forward with regards to implementation. And then the second day is composed of field visits to local civil society organizations, national institutions, and government ministries to kind of show what SDG 16+ implementation looks like in practice on the ground. And then days 3 and 4 are more of the classic conference with your plenary and breakout sessions. So each year, the showcase obviously starts with a focus on the host country, which this year again is Timor-Leste, and the flagship theme is reconciliation, strong institutions, and inclusion. But then it broadens to include a variety of country and regional contexts, and really addresses the breadth of SDG 16+, which we know is a very far-reaching goal. And then I don't want to take up too much more time, but following the showcase, we produced an outcome document. So for those of you who are unable to attend, obviously we know that Dili is also quite far, but we will have this outcome document that will be produced following the showcase, which highlights all these best practices that are shared, lessons learned, and also major challenges faced. And so we will share that document once it is done, and it is also submitted to HLPF every year for official input. So that's kind of what the annual showcase, the 16+ Forum annual showcase is in a nutshell. And if you would like to have more information on it, we have all of our conference documents on our website. I will share the link here with everyone, and I'll also provide my email address. So please feel free to send me an email if you have any questions about the showcase or the 16+ Forum in general. I'd be more than happy to answer. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.
So just a quick follow-up from me.
Yeah.
I mean, we've had the showcase in Europe and in Sierra Leone in Africa last year, and this is the first time it's gone to Asia. And you talked a little bit
Correct.
about the leadership from Timor-Leste, which has obviously been a crucial country for the SDG 16+ community, right back into the negotiations, pushing for action. Can you say a little bit more about where you found leadership coming from other countries in the region, and that might help us think about how to to work with those countries in the coming year up to the SDG Action Platform?
Absolutely. So obviously, given that this showcase is being held in Timor, there will be quite a big regional focus on Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Some of the countries that we're working with closely this year include the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Australia, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, New Zealand. There are a number of Myanmar as well. So there are a number of countries that are doing a lot on SDG 16+ and are engaging a lot on this work, and will be sharing in the work that they're doing next week. But so there is it is very clear that as a region, there's a lot of interest in SDG 16+, and particularly from a wide variety of stakeholders. So not just civil society organizations or government, but like I said, the private sector is also extremely interested in seeing what they can do moving forward to help in this implementation of SDG 16+. So those are the main kind of countries in the region that we're working with. Of course, we also have, the 16+ Forum is composed of 12 member states from pretty much every continent, every region in the world. This year, again, the focus will be on Timor to begin, and then on the region. But we will also include, as we always do, context from throughout the world.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that.
Yeah, of course.
We now have a question that was submitted by Joe Haley from the World Justice Project, and World Justice Project is one of roughly 30 or so justice partners that's pushing quite hard to begin to make progress on the Justice for All targets. But I'm actually going to address this question to Ben Phillips, if he doesn't mind, and if he's still with us. Joe asks, as partner organisations pivot from making the case for SDG 16 plus to identifying solutions that work, how do we design programs that are practical, impactful, sustainable and scalable? And I wondered if you could say a little bit more on the inequality and exclusion work, about how you actually are going to try and move from this, this interest in this political space that you've created to scalable solutions that are going to lead to real results in terms of reductions in inequality and exclusion. Ben, over to
Thank you. Thanks, David. That's a great question. I think on inequality, the most important finding is this. There isn't one magic bullet policy. It doesn't exist. So there's no policy which on its own is enough to reduce inequality or even prevent the increase in inequality. You need to do a bunch of things. Given that governments need to do a bunch of things, they need to do stuff on labour laws to raise minimum wages, they need to expand public services, they need to make tax fairer, including starting to tax wealth as well as income, and have much more progressive taxes. They need to tackle gender and racial and other forms of discrimination. They need to do a bunch of things. Because of that, they really need to shift the political terrain. It's not enough to pursue one policy. And they really need to be successful and strong for several years in order to turn things around. So we're working with those governments on particular policies, and I've highlighted some of the areas that are important. But we're also working with those governments and working with civil society about how you shift the whole terrain. How do you change the public narrative, for example, from the idea that increasing minimum wages destroys the economy, to a recognition of the fact that when you increase minimum wages, you in fact boost the economy? How do you change the narrative that if you give cash benefits to poor people, they will just get drunk and stop working, to a recognition that actually people are working for their poverty, they're poor in work, and that when you put cash in people's hands, they use it wisely. So how do you change some of those narratives is very important. How do you build political coalitions for change? We know that when you try and pursue progressive policies, you will get a very, very strong counterattack from elite interests. How do you try and split some of those elite interests? How do you win over some of them? How do you win over a proportion of the middle classes to progressive reform? So we're working on the policies, but on the idea that what you need is a series. We're also working on the political coalition building and how you shift that. And we're working on this narrative question, this story question. I think you need to work on all. So I would say, when we say be realistic, that doesn't mean tone down the ambition. It means have a plan. So don't just say to governments, be heroically disastrous. Say to governments, be bold, and then work out how you will help give them the wind in their sails in order to be successful and pursue genuine progressive change.
Great, thanks, Ben. I'm now going to go to next to John Romano. And TAP has been doing a tremendous job at really trying to get momentum on the acceleration actions. But this is an invitation. Do put your hand up. Don't be shy. It would be great to get a diversity of voices speaking on this call. So if you do want to speak, put your hand up, or just put a message in chat if you're not sure how to put your hand up, or email Paula and we will come to you, or even just jump in. And we'll sort that out. But we'll go to John and then we'll open it to other people. And I've got a couple of more questions that have been submitted to come to as well. John.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, David. And thanks also for hosting this. I wanted to take an opportunity to kind of build on some of the things that have already been said about mobilizing for the 2020 summit next year, about building on what we gathered from the SDG Summit this past year, and particularly, David, on the areas that you covered around the accelerator actions, the commitments, both from member states, but also from the wider stakeholder community, and just provide some reflections and maybe some thoughts on where we go from here. And I think what we got from the SDG Summit, I think, as David mentioned, it was great. It was great in terms of building that momentum around accelerator actions on SDG 16+. But I think we all know that we need more. And I think we also realize that we need a bit more accountability as well. And I'll touch a little bit on that in just a second. But just to say, I think David alluded to it earlier, is that there have been a lot of commitments, not just from governments or the private sector, but also from civil society. TAP, over the past year and a half or so, we've also been starting to collect these commitments from civil society, particularly colleagues that are working at the national and local level. And thus far, we have up to 110 total commitments from civil society. And we're now obviously working on linking that up with the UNDESA platform that David mentioned previously as well. I think one of the things that we do every year, but it's particularly important for us this year because we are now doing a strategic planning process for the TAP network as we speak. But some of the reflections from the consultations with our colleagues over the past handful of months from our network members touch on a few things. I mean, what we'll do is we'll put together a synthesis report from these consultations. So all of this information is available publicly to colleagues from the SDG 16 plus community. But just a few reflections from that, building on some of the momentum built from the SDG 16 plus, the SDG Summit. I think the first is on SDG 16 plus localization. I think that's a critical element for member states. Obviously, I think context matters. Getting member states and governments, whether it's national governments or local authorities, to take up SDG 16 as a priority and include it in their national or local planning processes is hugely critical. And I think those accelerator actions are a way for us to make sure that governments are making those explicit commitments and making them publicly available. And so on that front, we've just started work around the SDG 16 plus localization consortium, which really helps build on some of the great work that civil society organizations have done around SDG 16 plus localization already, building upon that work, showcasing the great work that's being done by colleagues at the national, local level, and then helping strengthen those activities going forward. The second reflection, and I think David mentioned this as well, is the financing challenge. It's a financing challenge from a government perspective. We obviously need governments to dedicate adequate budgets, budget lines to support SDG 16 plus implementation. That's incredibly important. But it's also important for us to take a look at the funding gaps within civil society as well. I mean, kind of tying into the localization from the civil society side of things. I think it's a particular challenge for local and grassroots civil society organizations to access a lot of funding streams, especially from donors. So there's a big challenge there that we'll be looking to unpack a bit further going forward. There's a lot more needed around SDG 16 spotlight reporting. So shadow reporting, reports from civil society working at the national level in particular. So we'll be working on showcasing those reports, doing analysis of them, and then further capacity building support. And then finally on the accountability side, I think civil society in general, I think it's been great to see all this movement around the decade of action. That's obviously hugely important, and we'll obviously engage on that front continuously as well. But there's this need for something complementary and ensuring accountability for SDG 16 plus and the broader 2030 agenda. So we'll be looking to build on the work that we've done with our SDG Accountability Handbook that we launched this year and mobilize what we're calling a decade of accountability for the SDGs, which runs complementary and parallel to this decade of action, which will be spearheaded by civil society, but will include a wider range of stakeholders that we know are important for SDG accountability. I think I'll stop there. Don't want to take too much time, and I can send links after this and my email address. There's obviously a lot more to it, but of course, if you are interested in submitting commitments, if you're a civil society organization and you're interested in submitting your commitments to the TAP platform, you can find more information on our website. It's tapnetwork2030.org/join, and you can find much more information about the SDG Accountability Handbook and the Decade of Accountability on our website at sdgaccountability.org. So I'll stop there. There's a lot to unpack.
Brilliant, John. Thank you so much. And thank you amongst many points for bringing us back to finance and the real importance of getting serious about finance this year. I think some of the work we're seeing on justice is a good example of both getting the case for investment right with OECD, World Bank and others leading on that, but also the beginning of trying to put together a financing package that could be announced at the action platform that would begin to provide some financing space for justice. And I think we need to see that a lot across many of the SDG 16 plus targets or clusters of targets if we're really to get serious about the decade of action. I've also got one slight correction. I said I thought it was going to be a long time before we knew the theme for the HLPF in 2020, but I'd actually just had it pointed out to me there has been an initial proposal from the PR of New Zealand, who's facilitating this process, and she suggested transformative pathways to realise the decade of action and delivery for sustainable development. In other words, a theme slap bang in the space that we're talking about. So I think that would be very helpful. I'm now going to go to Nina Blackwell, who is Executive Director of the Firelight Foundation, who has an intervention. Nina, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And look, thanks for the opportunity to actually ask what I put into the chat as a really naive question. My apologies. Firelight is a grant-making organisation that supports organisations born and raised in community. So my question comes from a little bit outside of the 16 plus agenda. We're a little bit of an outsider to this conversation, but now an enthusiastic insider, perhaps. My question is about how, what opportunities might exist or what we might point to for where the voice and agency of real grassroots organisations might be. So the involvement of civil society is such an exciting and important part of this push. What I want to make sure is we're not mistaking civil society writ large for national NGOs or international NGOs. How do we make room for, or is there already room for organisations that were born and raised in community, so true community voices, to get more involved? And I apologise, that's both a naive and very complicated question. So, yeah, thank you.
No, thanks so much for that, Nina. And it is absolutely, I think, a critical question of that touches on some of the localization challenge that John spoke about, some of the mobilization that I think we heard from Ben, but the bigger question of how we do what the agenda promised, particularly for younger people. I'm trying to look for the quotes here, but it promised, where is the quote? Yes, it promised that it said that children and young women and men are critical agents of change and will find in the new goals a platform to channel their infinite capacities for activism into the creation of a better world. And I think we know that we have done not nearly enough to provide that platform for activism so far. I think there are positive examples in the SDG 16 plus world, and I think Ben might want to chip in on this. But we have the network of legal empowerment activists and grassroots defenders of justice that Namati and others have pulled together, which is, I think, bringing the voice of justice defenders to the table. But it's also indicating that these justice defenders are under attack often physically. Their funding is being threatened, so we need to create space if they're to be effective actors. With an OGP, Open Government Partnership, we have a mechanism for bringing civil society, grassroots, I think in some cases, but certainly civil society voices together with government to co-create action plans for open government. And we have Global Citizen and others beginning to try and reach out to bigger networks. But I think this is really just the beginning of this bigger mobilization. And until we tap into these voices, we're going to miss a lot. But Ben, do you want to just quickly come in on that question?
Sure, thanks, David. It was such a great question. I mean, I think there's so many different parts to that question and to this issue. You know, and I put in the chat that quote from Shirley Chisholm, which is that if there's not a space for you at the table, bring a fold-up chair. And I think that we also know that civil society needs to demand space, needs to be challenging. We shouldn't overdo the civil part of civil society and be a bit too polite. In terms of work around ensuring that governments meet the pledges of the SDGs, I think it's important for civil society not to overly devote or overly warp their focus to formal official processes, to New York processes. The most important thing that happens back home when ordinary people, not necessarily using the languages of SDGs, they might use them as a tool or a hook, but when ordinary people speaking about their own country's constitution, their own national values, speak out and demand as people from that country that their rights are upheld, that their constitutional promises are fulfilled, and that they get the services, the quality of governance, the rights that they deserve. I think that's absolutely key. We know also that when you want to tackle inequality, you have to have a strong, vibrant, fearless civil society. It cannot be done from the top down. So we make the case within the Grand Challenge to governments, to the UN, to others, that making space for civil society, recognizing that they will challenge you and push you, is key for any government that's serious about tackling inequality. We make that case to them. We try to make space in the initiative. My own background is in civil society. I helped to bring together the Fight Inequality Alliance, which connects over 300 grassroots organizations with trade unions, social movements, NGOs and others, all pushing for action on inequality. So that's my own background, and that's what we try to make that space there. But I would say to those people whose job is, full-time job is either in civil society or is supporting civil society, keep pushing, call for space to be made, but when it isn't made, just take it, and continue to be demanding, continue to be challenging, continue to be difficult. Don't be too polite and too nice, because it's when people are tough and challenging to their governments that that's the only time they ever get anything from them. So, but it's such a good question. I think all of us need to be aware of that we don't suck out time from civil society and have them spend too much time in meetings in New York, that we don't try and tame them, that we don't kind of language police them, but that we are always on their side and always backing them up and speaking out when they get squashed. So I think it's a brilliant question, and I encourage you to keep holding everyone to account on that, and to keep pushing in the forceful way that you do. So thanks so much for bringing up that issue.
Okay, we're beginning to run low on time, but we've got time for one more question, and I think Paula's had something sent in. So over to you, Paula.
Thank you, David. So Irvin Waller from University of Ottawa, Canada, who couldn't be here, unfortunately, sent the question. I would have liked to have learned about accelerator events on SDG 16.1 and related on SDG 16.2 and 5.2.
Okay, so this is really a question about actions on preventing violence, and I don't think we've got time to go into this in a great deal of detail, but I think this is an area where we really are seeing action, and often action that stretches down or reaches down into communities. So there's a new initiative on preventing violence in cities, trying to halve violence in cities, called Peace in Our Cities, which was registered as an acceleration action. There's been a lot of work around violence against children, including trying to give a strong voice for children themselves, and the Executive Committee of the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children meet tomorrow to consider exactly these questions about how to mobilize in the in the next year. And I think we're also seeing some quite tangible stuff on preventing human rights abuses beginning to emerge. So I think we can't go into this in detail, but one idea for the future of these calls is to have a series of thematic calls where we would be able to take an issue like halving violence and look at it in more detail. So we're beginning, well, we are running out of time. I've been back to Ben a couple of times, but I'm going to just very quickly go back to Jeff and see if you have 30 seconds where you want to pick up on anything that's been said before we close.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the things that Ben has spoken of is, how do we change and challenge the narrative? And I mean, and I think this is a very important issue when it comes to UN 75 and global governance. I mean, we all saw at this year's General Assembly that there was a real stark divide that's now defining international relations, the split between globalists, so-called globalists and patriots. And I think this is a false dichotomy that we we in civil society really need to confront and address. And so I think we need to use the UN 75 anniversary as an opportunity to bring this conversation down to the grassroots level. I think this is where the UN 75 global dialogues, global conversations that the Secretary General is pushing for can have real utility to address these issues and get the voices of our compatriots at the local and national levels into the conversation to address the profound dysfunction and one could almost say paralysis in terms of the United Nations and our global governance structures. How can we break through that to have more effective democratic accountability at the global level? Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jeff. Thanks to Ben, and thanks to everybody who's contributed either by speaking or by putting stuff into the chat. I just haven't been able to fully focus on the chat window, but I can see an enormous number of resources have been flashing past as we've been speaking. We're now a minute over time, so I will bring the call to a close. I'd like to thank you for coming for this first call of a new mobilization. I do hope that we can keep coming together as a community to think about this opportunity in 2020 and to work practically together. We started work for the SDG Summit 18 months ahead of the summit, and DESA actually say that one of the reasons that they launched the registry for acceleration action and had this big focus on acceleration action was because the SDG 16+ community was so early in there talking about it. So I think it shows that we can be influential if we do organize, if we do come together, and if we do pool our resources. As Paula said at the beginning, we're going to be launching a survey or sending you a survey so we can see how we can get the most out of these calls going forward. So please do fill that in to give us your thoughts. And we've heard today about an enormous number of events, and one of the big challenges is tracking those events. So we have an app for that. Paula will send around details of that, an app which is intended to bring together all the SDG 16+ events into one place and give you an easy insight into what is happening and where. So if you have an event coming up, please do submit details so that we can put it in the app and we can publicize it to the wider community. So we're over time now. Thank you so much for joining. Let's keep coming together in the countdown to the SDG Action Platform, to the 75th anniversary, and let's make 2020 a year for accelerating action for SDG 16+. Thank you and goodbye.